You apologize for things that don't need apologies, for taking too long to reply, for asking a question, for needing something, for being in the way, even when you're not. It's automatic now reflex, muscle memory. You say, "I'm sorry," before you've even processed what you're apologizing for. And to everyone else, it seems polite, considerate, but to you, it feels like something else. Like you're apologizing for the fact that you exist at all. This isn't about manners, it's about something deeper. Something you learned a long time ago, in moments when your presence felt like too much, or your needs felt like a burden. You learned that shrinking made things easier. That apologizing kept you safe. And now, even when no one is angry, even when nothing is wrong, you still do it. Because somewhere inside, you still believe that taking up space is a risk. There's an exhaustion that comes with this. A quiet, constant fatigue that no one else sees. You apologize for speaking, for interrupting, even when there was silence, for feeling something, for not feeling enough, for reacting the wrong way. You apologize for being upset, and then you apologize for apologizing. It becomes a loop, and beneath it all is a belief you've carried for years, that your presence is conditional, that you're allowed to be here only if you're easy, undemanding, small. You've trained yourself to read the room before you enter it, to monitor tone, body language, micro-expressions. You've become an expert in making yourself digestible. And when you do take up space, when you assert a need, express a preference, or simply exist loudly for a moment, it feels wrong, dangerous even. So you pull back, you smooth it over, you say, "Sorry, never mind," and you return to the version of yourself that feels safer, the one who doesn't ask for much. This behavior didn't come from nowhere. Chronic apologizing is a trauma-adapted response. It's not about politeness or low self-esteem in the way most people assume. It's a survival strategy, learned in environments where your emotional visibility was met with rejection, irritation, or punishment. Maybe your needs were ignored. Maybe expressing yourself led to conflict, coldness, or withdrawal of love. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, too needy, too much, and so you learned to preemptively manage other people's comfort by erasing your own. Psychologically, this is called appeasement. It's a nervous system response to perceived threat. When your brain registers that your presence might cause discomfort, tension, or displeasure, it activates a de-escalation strategy. Minimize yourself, apologize, defer, smooth things over, make yourself unthreatening. This happens below conscious awareness. Your body is trying to regulate danger before it escalates, and for a long time, it worked. Apologizing kept you safe. It kept the peace. It keeps people from being disappointed in you. But the cost was high, because every time you apologize for something that didn't require an apology, you reinforced a belief that you are the problem, that your presence is inherently disruptive, that you need to earn the right to be treated with patience, and that the price of that is constant self-monitoring and self-minimization. Over time, this becomes your identity. You stop noticing when you're doing it. It becomes the lens through which you interpret every interaction. And the part of you that knows you deserve to take up space, that part gets quieter, buried under years of conditioning that taught you the opposite. Here's what happens when you spend years apologizing for your existence. You stop being seen. Not because people reject you, but because you've become so skilled at being unobtrusive that there's nothing left to see. You become someone people like, but don't really know. Someone who's easy to be around, but hard to connect with, because connection requires presence, and presence requires risk. But risk feels unbearable when you've learned that your visibility leads to discomfort. So instead, you stay surface level. You're helpful, accommodating, and thoughtful, but you're not honest. You don't say what you actually think. You don't express what you actually need. You've edited yourself so thoroughly that you aren't sure what's left underneath. And the loneliness that comes with this is profound, because you're surrounded by people, but none of them know you. Not really. They know the version of you that's been carefully curated to not cause friction. And that version isn't whole. It's a performance of okayness, a constant reassurance that you won't be too much. And beneath that performance is a person who's tired, who wants to stop monitoring, who wants to exist without apology. But I don't know how. There's also shame, a deep, pervasive shame that tells you this is your fault. That if you were more confident, more secure, more self-assured, you wouldn't feel this way. But that's not true. This isn't a confidence problem, it's a safety problem. Your nervous system learned that being small keeps you safe. And until that gets addressed, no amount of positive thinking will change the reflex. Here's the paradox. You want to be seen, but you've built your entire relational strategy around not being seen. You long for connection, for intimacy, for someone to know you fully. But intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like exposure. So instead, you stay behind the apology. You stay in the safe zone of politeness and accommodation. You stay in the version of yourself that doesn't ask for too much, doesn't take up too much room, doesn't need too much reassurance. And it works, in a way. People don't get frustrated with you. They don't pull away, but they also don't come closer, because there's nothing to come closer to. You've removed all the edges, all the complexity, all the parts of yourself that might be inconvenient or difficult. And what's left is a version of you that's tolerable, but not real. The truth is, you're protecting yourself from rejection, from disappointment, from the possibility that if people saw the full version of you, needs, emotions, desires, boundaries, they might leave. And that fear is valid, because maybe, at some point, that's exactly what happened. Maybe you were too much once, and it cost you. So now, you make sure you're never too much again. But the cost of that is connection. Real, deep, honest connection. The kind where you don't have to perform. The kind where your presence isn't conditional. If this continues, it doesn't get easier. It calcifies. The longer you live in this pattern, the more normal it feels. And the more normal it feels, the harder it becomes to imagine anything different. Your relationships stay shallow. Not because people don't care, but because you've never let them in. You become the person people reach out to when they need support, but who never asks for support in return. You become the one who's always fine, always flexible, always understanding. And over time, that becomes your role. Not because you chose it, but because you've been playing it for so long that no one knows there's another version of you underneath. There's also a psychological cost. Living in constant self-suppression creates a deep disconnection from your own needs, preferences, and emotional reality. You stop knowing what you want because you've spent so long prioritizing what everyone else wants. You stop trusting your own feelings because you've been taught that your feelings are inconvenient. And eventually, you stop believing that your inner world matters at all. That's not a small thing. That's the erosion of self. And it happens slowly, quietly, one apology at a time. Until one day, you realize you don't know who you are anymore. You only know who you've had to be in order to stay safe. But here's the reframe. This was never a flaw. It was an adaptation. You didn't become someone who apologizes for everything because you're weak, insecure, or broken. You became this way because you're perceptive. Because your nervous system is highly attuned to relational threat. Because at some point, you learned that your emotional visibility came with consequences, and you did what any intelligent person would do. You adapted. You found a way to survive in an environment that didn't have space for the fullness of who you were. And that adaptation worked. It kept you safe. It kept you connected, even if that connection was conditional. It allows you to navigate relationships without constant conflict or rejection. So, before you judge yourself for this, understand, apologizing wasn't a weakness. It was intelligence. It was your system's way of protecting you when you didn't have other options. The problem isn't that you developed this strategy. The problem is that you're still using it, even in environments where it's no longer necessary, even with people who wouldn't reject you for taking up space. Even in moments where your presence isn't a problem, you're still operating from the belief that you need to apologize for existing. And that belief, while it once kept you safe, is now keeping you small. So, what does healing look like? Not confidence, not forcing yourself to stop apologizing overnight, not pretending you don't feel what you feel. Healing looks like this, pausing before you apologize. Just a breath, just long enough to ask yourself, do I actually need to apologize, or am I trying to manage someone else's comfort? Sometimes, the answer will still be yes. And that's okay. But sometimes, the answer will be no. And in those moments, you can choose something different. You can say, thank you for waiting, instead of, sorry I'm late. You can say, I'd like to share something, instead of, sorry to interrupt. You can say nothing at all, and let your presence be enough. This isn't about becoming bold or assertive. It's about reclaiming the space you've been giving away. Slowly, gently, without pressure. It's about practicing presence without apology, not because you're confident, but because you're worth being here. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels risky, even when no one applauds you for it. You're also allowed to stop performing easily. You're allowed to have needs, to express preferences, to say, actually, that doesn't work for me. You're allowed to exist in your full complexity without editing yourself into something more digestible. And yes, some people might be uncomfortable with that, but their discomfort is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to stop betraying yourself in order to keep others comfortable. You don't have to change everything today. You don't have to become a different person. You don't have to force yourself into a version of confidence that doesn't feel real. All you need to do right now is notice. Notice when you apologize. Notice what you're actually apologizing for. Notice the fear underneath it. Notice the belief that says, I have to stay small to stay safe. And then, just once, try something different. Try letting yourself take up space without immediately smoothing it over. Try expressing a need without apologizing for having it. Try being present, even when it feels uncomfortable. Not because you're healed, not because you're confident, but because you're learning that your presence doesn't need to be earned. This takes time, and it takes gentleness. Because you're not just changing a behavior, you're changing a belief system that's been running your life for years. And that doesn't shift overnight, but it does shift, slowly, with repetition, with self-compassion, with the quiet, radical act of refusing to apologize for things that don't require apologies. You are not an interruption. You are not too much. You are not a burden for needing things, for feeling things, for existing in a way that takes up space. You are a person, a whole, complex, legitimate person, and your presence does not need to be apologized for. It never did. What you learned was survival, and survival made sense. But you don't have to survive anymore. You're allowed to exist, fully, without apology, without performance, without shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of acceptable. This is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to disappear. Before you learned that safety meant silence. Before you learned that love was conditional on how little space you took up. That person is still here. Beneath the apologies, beneath the fear, beneath the years of conditioning that taught you otherwise. And they're worth reclaiming, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily. One moment of unapologetic presence at a time.